On this channel, I've previously discussed my favorite British horror production studio, Hammer Horror, which, as the name would suggest, mastered much of the horror genre through the 1950s to the end of the 1970s. However, there was another studio that dripped so much horror in its production, it could be described as amicable, or Amicus. Failed puns aside, Amicus Productions was a British studio that produced a number of prominent sci-fi and horror films during the 1960s and 70s, having a technical debut in 1960 with the film City of the Dead. Although this film was released under Vulcan Productions, it still stakes its claim as Amicus's first release due to the fact that Amicus production founders Milton Subsidy and Max J. Rosenberg produced it. The studio's name is thought to originate with a supposed Latin translation of amicus being no budget, as stated by Amicus screenplay writer Robert Bloch, but some others say that apparently it means friend in Latin, and Google's opinion gives the basic definition of friend of the court. So, who really knows, but all definitions seem amicable for the styling, aesthetic, and production of Amicus. While it's typical to confuse Amicus Pictures with Hammer Productions, as they did share directors and thespians alike with such personal favorites including Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, and Ingrid Pitt. In addition, the quality in Amicus and Hammer production visual styles is similar, but Amicus dared to differentiate themselves by focusing more on portmanteau, or as any non-pretentious person would just say, anthology. Some might say that this differentiation is still not enough to prevent confusion between the two, as I thought for the longest time that one of the films on this list was a Hammer horror production, but we'll let them slide as we want to maintain Amicus relations with Amicus. Though they laid their production studio to rest in the late 1970s, we Amicus fans have something to look forward to, as it has been announced that Amicus will be making a comeback with a new anthology horror film entitled In the Grip of Terror, which is at the moment a Kickstarter project linked in the description below. Now that we have a pretty amicable grip on Amicus, let's go over some of my favorite Amicus production horrors. Madhouse. So, I know I just said that one of the distinctive aspects of Amicus Productions was their tendency towards an anthology, but I thought I'd start off with one that was not a portmanteau. I hope I'm saying that right. And speaking of being not a portmanteau, if you've enjoyed what you've seen so far, that technically fits more into the list category than anthology, be sure to give this video a like, share, and subscribe, and let me know what your favorite Amicus film is. Madhouse was one of the first Amicus films that I watched and immediately needed to see more. Featuring the incomparable legend of horror himself, Vincent Price plays the main character Paul Toombs, a horror film star portraying an infamous horror deviant, Dr. Death. It's really meta, I know. Released in 1974, the title of this film is also known as The Revenge of Dr. Death and is based upon the 1969 novel Devil Day by Angus Hall. Although Jim Clark directed this movie, who creatively assisted on the infamous Midnight Cowboy and edited Marathon Man in 1976 as well as The Killing Fields in 1984, Robert Fiost, who directed the Dr. Phibes films, was originally intended to be the director on this film. Madhouse also features another horror legend and everyone's favorite Empire officer, Peter Cushing. You know, I'm just mad about Mr. Cushing and his villainous roles, and this one does not disappoint. We also have performances given by some other thespians I have mentioned previously on this channel. Robert Quarry, aka Count Yorga, who ironically portrays an adult film director, and Adrienne Corey, who plays Fay Flay, and who I've mentioned for her role in Vampire Circus. While this film isn't the greatest there's ever been in Amicus, I'm not mad about the campiness of this film and just how meta the whole plot is in general. And while we're talking about camp, let's not forget to mention my favorite part of this film, Faye in the basement with pet spiders. I mean, come on. This is horror comedy gold. You'd have to be mad not to love it. Arachnids and actors aside, I love how this is much like a slasher with a little bit of a mystery plot interlaced through it. A man in a mask, various ridiculous deaths, and attempts at framing the great Vincent Price, Paul Toombs, as the murderer. While this film is not for the critically sound or serious horror fanatics, this film might be for you if you're like me and just mad about B-movie low-budget horror camp. And hey, it's Vincent Price. That should be enough. The House That Dripped Blood. Do you like vampires? Are you a fan of some late night witchcraft? Well, I'm no licensed real estate agent, but I have just the house for you. The only thing is that there's a bit of a leak. That's more like a drip, and you're not gonna wanna know what's dripping. One of Amicus's finest anthologies, The House That Dripped Blood, features all the best kinds of horrors, vampires, witchcraft, and caped costumes included. Originally, the title of this film was apparently supposed to be Death and the Maiden, as director Peter Duffel wanted to adopt composer Franz Schubert's score title. However, Amicus co-founder and producer Milton Spassky brought the axe down on that and gave it its current good Christian name, despite its deceptive aspect. Apparently, there's no blood. Ever. But there's plenty of scares. This anthology introduces 4 short stories with an overarching investigative plot line involving, you guessed it, a mysterious and spooky house. Many of the stories are based off of short stories featured in pulp magazines, which were written and adapted to screen by frequent Amicus writer Robert Bloch of Weird Tales, Unknown Worlds, and Fury by VID publications. I think that's really cool, and I initially didn't know that he published these well before the film was produced, so I think I'm gonna have to give them a read, and I also have included links where you can read them too. Most of them are available and are from scans of the original magazines. While The House That Dripped Blood excludes much of the blood we'd horror fans would expect, it still delivers in the frights as it features some really great actors, including amazing Hammer horror veterans Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee, and Ingrid Pitt, and also features the third Doc of Doctor Who, Jon Pertwee. It makes sense that this film was supposedly originally intended to be a comedy horror rather than just a horror, because although some of the more comedic sequences were taken out, some remnants of camp still remain. Another fun fact with this film is that apparently Jon Pertwee based his character in The Cloak on his fellow thespian and friend who is in this film as well, Christopher Lee. Now the slight in the story makes sense.
Dracula. The one with Bela Lugosi, of course, not this new fella.
I'll say that my favorites of this Amicus anthology would have to be Sweets to the Sweet and The Cloak. What can I say? I have a soft spot for Christopher Lee and Ingrid Pitt. To this day, The House That Dripped Blood remains one of my favorite horror anthologies and Amicus productions. I'm just gonna have to be wary of entering any haunted houses or any other buildings that have sus liquids dripping from them. The skull. So I'll ask once more, how's your head? You know, I really can't give that joke up. It's just so good. And just as a heads up, there'll be more to come. This 60s horror is another one of Amicus's singular plotline films that features the dynamic horror duo Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. At this point, maybe my channel should use the tagline, the Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee Fan Club, because we've mentioned them quite a lot. The Skull was directed by frequent Hammer horror and Amicus Productions director Freddie Francis and is based on Robert Bloch's short story, The Skull of Marquis de Sade. Although producer and Amicus co-founder Milton Spassky, I really don't know if I'm saying his last name right, adapted Bloch's story for the screen, a lot of it was rewritten by Francis. What can I say about this film that I don't love? Not much. It's classic, coveted, cursed object horror and really gives us a Christopher Lee performance in rare form, a character who is not villainous. Peter Cushing is also wonderful in his role as a collector and skull acquirer, and just because I like him, I have to mention Michael Goh's inclusion in this film, as he's another horror thespian constant across Hammer and Amicus. Thought to be the film to be set up as competition to Hammer horror films as a full-length color feature, The Skull gives spooky occult vibes and interesting angles for days. And I'm just saying, the fact that this film ends with almost no dialogue, it's still highly entertaining and worth a watch or 20,000. While the whereabouts of the real skull of Marquis de Sade are unknown, the skull in this film, which is supposed to be Marquis de Sade, makes itself known to all. And while the Marquis' skull was made known everywhere else, the promotional cards and taglines had to be changed in France due to legal action taken by the Sade family, which I think is kind of funny considering I don't even think of Marquis de Sade having a present-day legacy, you know? He seems like such an ancient figure. Let's also mention the musical score of this film being written by master avant-garde composer and frequent composer for British horror and Amicus Productions film, Elizabeth Lutens. I really don't know how to pronounce a lot of these people's names, so forgive me if I'm getting them wrong. I personally really enjoy Lutens' unsettling and dramatic style, and it fits pretty well for the plot of this film. Even though many might find this film a bit reserved for an Amicus production, I think that it's a nice change of pace and offers a pretty entertaining scenario for the casual viewing. It also reminds us that no one knows what it's like to be the bad man behind skull eyes. Our last one is The Vault of Horror. It's not horror from the basement or the attic, and it's also not from a creepy crypt. It's horror from the vault. And you know, there's nothing like a little shared daydreaming between strangers to really make you feel even more disconnected and dissuaded from reality, especially when your daydreams are more like reoccurring nightmares and do everything but offer up Freddy Krueger to make you not want to fall asleep. The Vault of Horror is another Amicus anthology that brings all the repressed, psychotic inclinations to the screen. While its title might reference the early 1950s horror comics of the same name, none of the stories featured in the film ever actually appeared in the Vault of Horror comics. Instead, most of the stories, with the exception of The Neat Job and shock suspense stories, were featured in Tales from the Crypt, the original 1950s horror comics, not the previous released Amicus film or TV series. Filmed on location in London and at Twickenham Film Studios in London, the largest film studio in the UK at the time of its initial construction, the Vault of Horror covers tales of vampires, domestic dispute, insurance fraud, and voodoo in visual art form. While it's easy to compare this film with Amicus's prior release of Tales from the Crypt, it's best if you don't. I'll admit that I do prefer Tales from the Crypt over the Vault of Horror, but I do have a soft spot for the 1973 anthology. I also think that this would have been really cool if we could have gotten the Vault Keeper, like we had the Crypt Keeper in Tales from the Crypt, but I think that maybe they were trying to not make it so obvious that they were trying to get another successful Tales from the Crypt-like film as another cash grab. So yeah, let's exclude a keeper and keep the rest. Yep, totally different. I'd have to say that I do enjoy most of the stories, jugular vein dispenser definitely included, but they're not as insidious and sinister feeling as the ones from Crypt. Didn't I just say it's best not to compare the two? Anyway, some of my favorites from Vault are Midnight Mess, This Trick'll Kill You, and Drawn and Quartered. I do think that this film is one of Amicus's best anthology tries, even though it's clearly supposed to be another Crypt cash grab, but if you're in the mood to marathon some Amicus anthology, I'd add this to the list. Or should I say, pull this from the vault? Amicus Productions was a British horror film production company that operated mainly from the 1960s through to the 1970s, competing with fellow British production company Hammer Horror. While its name's meaning is debatable, we can all agree that Amicus produced pretty amicable results in this sci-fi horror genre and gave us some thrills in their anthology-focused approach. Whether you're interested in haunted house hunting or collecting possessed occult paraphernalia, Amicus Productions has all the frights for all us horror queens and fiends. Thanks for watching, everybody. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!